Welcome back, students. So we can pick up where we left off in the last video. Now that we've discussed some of these general terminology and overview of the structure of the brain, we're now going to get into the specifics about the regions and structures that you would see in a fully developed human brain. And so we're going to begin with the brainstem, which is the most inferior part of our brain and is what would have evolved first, essentially. This is kind of the earliest version of a coordinated processing center for a central nervous system. And so this brainstem is composed of three different distinct structures. We have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, kind of in that order from inferior to superior, which all are going to be mostly related to the autonomic nervous system and visceral control, these things that are below your consciousness, below your awareness. But before we can start talking about the specifics, I want to quickly note on this idea of brain nuclei, as you're going to see different named nuclei show up in a lot of the figures, and only a few of them are. I'm only asking you to learn about or memorize or know the function of a few of them. But a brain nucleus, so in neuroanatomy, the term nucleus is referring to a cluster of neurons in the central nervous system that is going to be deep to our cerebral hemispheres or the brainstem. So these are essentially the equivalent to ganglia from the peripheral nervous system, where you had groups of neural bodies and their axons that would lead together. So these groups of neural bodies in the central nervous system are these nuclei. Okay? And so typically, each nuclei is going to share a specific function. They all work together to regulate a specific function or pathway. And so it's going to be dense groups of neural bodies surrounded by white matter, the axons leaving from those neural bodies to communicate with the other structures throughout the brain that play a role in that function. All right. So first, taking a look at the major functions of these different regions of the brainstem. So they're organized here to represent structurally where they would be. The midbrain is the most superior, and the medulla oblongata is the most inferior. Again, this is specific to humans. If you were looking at a quadrupedal animal, I guess the medulla oblongata would be the most posterior, and the midbrain would be the most anterior. This essentially, again, matches that idea of evolutionary timeline. The medulla oblongata would have been the earliest version of a brain. And so this is essentially the processing center, the control center for all of our autonomic functions. So the autonomic nervous system is kind of led by this medulla oblongata. So coordinating all of those internal reflexes that keep you alive without your conscious awareness or control, like breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, and reflexes that are keeping your body functioning without you realizing that you need to do that, like vomiting, swallowing, coughing, sneezing. Right? These are in a large part being regulated and controlled by the medulla oblongata. And now, as a part of a larger, more complex brain system, the medulla oblongata also works very closely with the diencephalon, our thalamus and hypothalamus, which we'll introduce later, as a part of the reticular formation, which is a coordinated group of nuclei that all work together towards habituation, kind of allowing things to function in a regular pattern without needing to pay close attention to them, kind of cutting out the noise and only bringing to your awareness those sensations that are super important or may potentially be important. Right? So one easy example or common example of this habituation would be the lack of sensation that you have for the clothes on your skin. Right? Technically, you are continuously sensing that feeling, that sense of touch, as you have something constantly firing those sensory receptors on your skin, telling you there is something touching you. But because that awareness of that sensation is unnecessary, this isn't something that you need to know to keep you alive, the reticular formation, this RAS system, cuts out that focus. It sends those signals elsewhere, just keeps it autonomic, keeps it visceral, and so you aren't consciously aware of that feeling at all times. However, if you were to all of a sudden sense a lack of feeling where you expected there to be clothing, so like for some reason something came and cut off your sleeve and all of a sudden you no longer have that sensation, that reticular formation would also be responsible for noticing that new sensation and sending that to your awareness. So the medulla oblongata has a pretty wide range of functions and pathways that it is playing a role in. But again, that's all mainly part of the autonomic nervous system, your subconscious, below your awareness. Moving superior to the medulla oblongata, we have the pons, which kind of forms this almost Adam's apple looking structure, this round part. There's a better view here, right? If this were the throat, right, the pons looks like an Adam's apple kind of protruding anteriorly like that. And the pons is going to be mainly playing a role as a relay center for the cerebellum, which we'll again introduce later. But so its job is to connect these signals coming from the body and from your cerebrum to the cerebellum and vice versa. And then lastly, as a part of our brainstem, the most superior is our midbrain or mesencephalon. And its main role is going to be part of our reward system, motivation and reward through dopamine release, but also plays a role in alertness, muscle tone, and then has special nuclei, these superior and inferior colliculi, that are responsible for coordinating some complex sensory inputs. So together, both of them are going to help with your coordination of visual information and auditory information in order to produce a complex coordinated response, right? Kind of like a reflex, like if something is flying at you, you can automatically dodge or reach a hand up to catch it without necessarily noticing that thing is flying at you or before you are consciously aware of that. This midbrain is playing a big role in that reflex, that quick response before it reaches your awareness. And so we can see a bit more of that organization here. Again, not asking you to memorize most of these nuclei. I will be specific to the ones that you should be aware of. You should know a bit about the particular formation, as we did just discuss it, but you don't need to know the rest of the nuclei by name in the medulla oblongata here. The pons here, we can get a good sense of why it would be playing a role as a relay center for the cerebellum, as the cerebellum is essentially directly attached to the posterior of that pons and doesn't really have a direct connection to any other part of the brainstem or brain. And here is our midbrain. We're looking at a posterior view here where we can see our superior colliculi and our inferior colliculi, which again are nuclei responsible for some of those complex sensory processing for our special senses like sight and hearing. So next, we can look at the cerebellum, which is posterior to that pons, right? And it is quite a large structure. It's that really wrinkly part at the posterior and inferior of your brain. And the cerebellum is mostly responsible for coordinating our motor control, right? Kind of taking in our information about proprioception, so your body's sense of how it is positioned in space, that is proprioception. So your awareness of where you are. And it's taking in the direction, the motor control that's coming from your cerebrum, telling your body to do a thing, such as what I'm doing with my arms right now, or move forward or move backwards, right? Those signals are coming from the brain. The cerebellum is integrating that directive with sensory information from the body to get a better sense of where we are positioned in space, our proprioception, and our balance, and then sending out a coordinated motor signal that is allowing you to produce that movement without falling flat on your face, right? Keeping you balanced, keeping you upright in your space to try to prevent damage. Right? That is the cerebellum. And a big part of our motor learning, being controlled by the cerebellum as well, right? Learning from mistakes. So again, with the goal of keeping you from damaging yourself while moving through your environment. The cerebellum has a highly structured white matter region in the middle that makes kind of this tree-looking structure, and thus was given the name arbor vitae, which means the tree of life. And so that term, arbor vitae, is just referring to this dense white matter that is coordinating with the gray matter on the edges, the superficial gray matter of the cerebellum, and those sending those signals back through the pons to the cerebrum, to the body, etc. Okay. So now we're moving into what is considered like the rat brain. We're moving away from our brainstem and cerebellum, these super early versions of a brain, and getting into some more recent evolutionary developments, more mammalian brain structures, to get these higher order processing centers. And so the diencephalon, di for two, is just referring to these two regions, the thalamus and hypothalamus. And so we can see that now sitting on top of superior to our midbrain at the very top. This is going to be essentially our last structure before we get into the cerebrum. And so this is almost at the border between this brainstem and brain. Taking another view here, this posterior view of our brainstem with the diencephalon, we get a good look at the choroid plexuses that I was referring to in the last video. These are the specialized ependymal cells that are there to produce all of the cerebrospinal fluid of the central nervous system. And so those choroid plexuses, that sit on the roof of the third ventricle are basically directly attached to the thalamus here. And the ones that sit on the roof of the fourth ventricle are basically attached to the pons. They're in between the pons and the cerebellum. And then we would have another choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles, which is going to be part of our cerebrum. So the thalamus is not visible from an external view, from a superficial view. You would have to take a sagittal section to get, or I guess a coronal section as well would do it. To get a view of the thalamus, it's sitting deep here, almost in the center of the brain. It creates this little bean-like shape. And the thalamus's main job is to be the relay center for our somatic nervous system, the things we are going to become aware of. Okay? So the medulla oblongata was essentially coordinating and regulating where information was going for the autonomic nervous system, those visceral sensations and motor control that are below your awareness. The thalamus is our control center, our relay center for all of our somatic information, the things that are going to reach our awareness, our consciousness. Right? And thus its relationship with the medulla oblongata for habituation, right? They are deciding or helping each other in deciding what information needs to make it to our awareness. So there are a lot of different nuclei found within the thalamus because those are the groups of neurons that are directing information to the relative regions of the cerebrum that have their own specialization for your somatic nervous system. But also part of this diencephalon sitting kind of anterior and inferior to the thalamus is our hypothalamus, which is kind of this region we have here. So this is our thalamus, and then this is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus has a couple jobs, but mainly its role is to regulate kind of the hormone release as a response to nervous signaling, sending those long-range chemical messengers through the blood via its control of the pituitary gland, which I don't know if I see labeled in this image. It's not labeled in this image, but it would be sitting kind of here, and that goes and sits into the sella turcica of your sphenoid bone. Here's a better look at that. So our hypothalamus with that pituitary gland, again, mainly relating to hormone control by its influence on the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland releases hormones related to growth, development, reproduction, stress and fear responses, metabolism, but it also is releasing hormones related to our sense of safety and happiness, and also playing a bit of a role in sleep, but that's mainly going to come back to our pineal gland, which we'll talk about in a minute. Yeah, the pituitary gland relating to our sense of safety, comfort, and happiness through the release of oxytocin and vasopressin. And so next, our final step before we can start talking about the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex is our limbic system. And this limbic system is referring to the network of nuclei and pathways of white matter that are sitting at the border between the diencephalon and our cerebrum. So limbus refers to the border, and so this limbic system is that these nuclei and white matter networks that are at that border between the diencephalon and cerebrum. And these are all mainly going to play a role in emotion, memory, and then some of our motivation. Right? So essentially the reason why your body actually has a drive to do the things that keep it alive. Right? We can have these signals that are trying to keep the body alive, but having the actual drive and motivation to do it is a separate thing. And that's where this limbic system comes in, right? That drive, that motivation, making your brain want to do the thing that keeps it alive. And so some structures you may have heard of in the past, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, these are nuclei within the limbic system. Okay? And so trying not to just like read at you all of these things. That's the main idea: emotion, memory, and motivation. We have some specific functions for each of these nuclei. For the role that they play, the pineal gland is an important one here, as it's control with circadian rhythm, controlling your sleep and wake cycle. Yep. Here's a good view of that here. Okay. So again, rather than being their own structure, these are mainly pointing to nuclei within these other larger structures like the hypothalamus and thalamus. And so lastly, we can get to the most superficial, the most superior, the largest region of our brain, which is the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex. These are technically separate things. The cerebral cortex is the part of the cerebrum, the most superficial, that outside area, which is mostly gray matter. Right? So these would be the receiving end, the neural bodies of your cerebrum. And those neurons within the cerebral cortex are what represent our somatic nervous system, our awareness, your consciousness, your personality, the things that make you you, and make you a higher order species. So within that cerebral cortex, that gray matter, right, those concentrated neural bodies, we get a bunch of specialized regions based on the function that those groups of neural bodies are responsible for, right? Similar to the nuclei that we were discussing. Okay. And that's going to give us these cortexes that we'll talk about in a second here. But first off, the cerebrum itself is organized into these 6 different lobes, the same way that we had 6 different major skull bones. And these lobes of the brain are going to correlate with those skull bones by name and location. So we have 1 frontal lobe, just like we had 1 frontal bone, 2 parietal lobes, 2 temporal lobes, and 1 occipital lobe. Again, in the same general location as the bones of the skull. Okay. And they are going to have some commonality between what functions those different lobes serve, but then we have even more specialization as far as the region within each lobe. Like I said, those are primarily gray matter making up the cortex, the outer port. We also have some important sulci, these major indents that separate each lobe. So the central sulcus separates the frontal from the parietal lobes, as you see here. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes, you see here. And then the parieto-occipital sulcus is what separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, which you can really only see once we've cut into a mid-sagittal section here. And so, like I said, within that cerebral cortex, we have some groupings that have specialized function. And so these are our specialized cortexes that have their own names, like the primary motor cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex, the visual cortex, auditory and olfactory cortexes, and then a lot of association areas that are going to help with integrating information between those specialized cortexes. Also not listed here, we have a gustation cortex for taste, and probably a couple more. Anyway, so some of the major ones to be aware of are especially our primary somatosensory cortex here in the parietal lobe and our primary motor cortex here in the frontal lobe. So these are separated essentially by that frontal sulcus, separating the frontal and parietal lobes. Where those two meet, this major gyrus on either side is what makes up these somatosensory cortexes for the parietal lobe, or the somatosensory cortex for the parietal lobe, and the primary motor cortex for the frontal lobe. And in these regions, we have a majority of the neural bodies that are going to be responsible for our conscious either sensation for the primary somatosensory cortex or motor control for the primary motor cortex. That information is going to also be assisted by these association areas, the premotor cortex and the somatosensory association cortex, but a majority of that sensation and the output of motor control are in those regions. The occipital lobe is mainly associated with our vision and has the primary visual cortex, as well as the visual association areas. And then our temporal lobe is mainly associated with our hearing, our auditory cortex, and associated regions related to vocabulary, speech. Right? And so some other more distinct, unique, specialized areas that are of specific interest when studying humans and our complex language system are these localizations for speech. So Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is a tight group, more similar to a nuclei rather than a cortex, that is specific for speech production. And then Wernicke's area is a tight group that is specific to language comprehension. So we do have a separation between the parts of our brain that are responsible for understanding what type of language is being produced at us. So whether that's speech, where you're hearing it, or written, you're reading it, all of that comprehension, the understanding of what is being communicated, that is happening in Wernicke's area. And then speech production, again, whether that's going to be written or verbally represented, that is processed in Broca's area. And these are separate. They're in slightly different regions of the brain. And they also tend to be localized to only one hemisphere, which is kind of unique. Our other cortexes were kind of transmitting across both hemispheres. But Broca's area and Wernicke's area tend to be localized to just one, either the left or the right. And we get a strong correlation between what side, which hemisphere of the brain these areas show up on, and the handedness of an individual, which is just kind of one of those weird associations that we don't fully understand yet. And so, for instance, for right-handed individuals, 99% of those are going to have their both Broca's and Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere, the opposite side. And similarly, a majority of left-handed people are going to have their Broca's and Wernicke's area localized in the opposite side, in this case, the right hemisphere. But we get a bit more variation in left-handed individuals, with about 15% of them having them on the same side, the left hemisphere, and 15% having bilateral speech localization, meaning that they have some firing of a Broca's and a Wernicke's area showing up in both hemispheres of their brain for either one or both of these processes, language comprehension and speech production. It's kind of cool. And so a common representation of these cortexes, specifically our somatosensory and our motor cortexes, are these homunculi, or a homunculus, which would either be represented like this strange-looking individual here, or representing just different parts of the body by following along that cortex, like we see here. And what this is representing is essentially the density, the concentration of neurons that are dedicated to either sensing from these different regions of the body or dedicated to motor control of these different regions of the body. And we do have a difference. There are certain parts of the body where we have a lot of neurons related to sensation, such as the genitals, but very little or no neurons related to motor control in our cerebral cortex, right? Because the motor control, the muscle control of the genitals is more controlled by your autonomic nervous system, not your somatic nervous system. Right? And so you can find some other differences moving along here, such as motor control of the tongue is much smaller here, whereas our sensation of the tongue is much higher as part of that specialized sense of taste. And so again, a homunculus is some visual representation of the concentration of neurons that are dedicated to either sensation or motor control of that region of the body. So if you were describing the sensory homunculus, that's related to the sensation from that region. If you're describing the motor homunculus, those are the nuclei dedicated to motor control of that region. And again, there is a difference. So the last part of this chapter, the last part of this slide deck is all just dedicated to cranial nerves, which we mainly focus on in lab. I'm not asking for you to memorize a whole lot related to the cranial nerves. We have 12 cranial nerves that are mainly coming from parts of the brainstem. We only have 2 cranial nerves actually coming from the cerebrum itself, but all of these are either leading from the brain or brainstem. That's what separates them from our spinal nerves. And all I would ask for you to know is essentially what is on each of these slides. I have a slide for each nerve, or in some cases, groups of nerves, like these 3 that work together to control the motor, the movement of the eye. Okay. So you should know the number and name, right? And numbers are represented in Roman numerals for these cranial nerves. You should know whether they are motor, sensory, or mixed nerves. And so this is a major difference from our spinal nerves as well. All of our spinal nerves were mixed. They had neurons dedicated to both sensation and motor control. But for cranial nerves, we tend to have separation. Some are motor, such as these 3, and some are strictly sensory, such as the optic nerve and the olfactory nerve. And then lastly, you should know generally where in the brain they are coming from, where they originate. And so that brings us to the end of this chapter. As always, please reach out if you have any questions or concerns, and I will see you in the next one.